The huge meeting room was filled with strange sounds. Clicks, buzzes, and weird music came from all directions. 12 different alien races sat around a giant circular table that glowed with soft blue light. Each group looked completely different from the others. The Zephyrians were tall and made of what looked like living crystal. Their bodies caught the light and threw rainbow colors across the walls. When they moved, tiny musical notes seemed to play in the air around them. The Aquarians had long tentacles instead of arms and legs. Their skin was wet and shiny, and they breathed through gills on their necks. Small water droplets floated around, their seats to keep them comfortable. The Mantari looked like giant praying mantis insects, but they walked on 2 legs and wore fancy robes. Their huge compound eyes could look in many directions at once. When they talked, their mouths clicked and clacked in rhythm. The Gorlakians were massive, like walking mountains of gray rock. Each one was 3 times taller than a human, and twice as wide. Their voices were so deep that the floor shook when they spoke. In one corner sat the Ethereals, who looked like floating ghosts made of silver mist. They barely seemed solid, and their voices sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The other 7 races were just as strange and wonderful, each one representing millions of years of evolution on distant worlds. At the smallest table in the room sat 2 humans. Commander Jake Peterson was a middle-aged man with short brown hair and calm blue eyes. He wore a simple blue uniform with silver buttons and a few medals on his chest. Next to him sat Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, a young woman with black hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She had a tablet computer in front of her and was taking notes. Jake looked around the room with interest but no fear. Amy seemed a bit nervous, which was normal since this was only the 3rd time humans had been invited to these meetings. Earth had only been part of the Galactic Council for 6 months, and most of the alien races still saw humans as the new kids who did not know much about anything. Admiral Vextar stood up at the head of the table. He was from a race called the Hegemony, and he looked like a mix between a lizard and a bird. He had 4 eyes, 2 on each side of his head, and his skin was covered in small blue and green scales. His voice came through a translation device that made him sound like he was speaking through water. "Today we discuss weapons," Admiral Vextar announced. "Each race will share knowledge about their most deadly historical weapons. This information will help us understand threats across the galaxy and protect our worlds better." The other aliens nodded or made whatever gestures their species used to show agreement. Jake noticed that several of them looked at the human table with what seemed like amusement. It was clear they thought humans had nothing important to add to this discussion. The Zephyrians went first. Their representative, a tall crystal being named Resonance of the Third Harmony, stood and waved one arm. The air above the table filled with images of massive weapons that looked like crystal cannons. "Our plasma cannons can reach temperatures of 50,000 degrees, Resonance explained in a voice like singing bells. "They can melt entire cities in minutes. We use them to defend our homeworld against the Dark Swarm 3,000 years. Go. One shot from our largest cannon can destroy a mountain." The other aliens made impressed sounds. Some clicked their approval, others hummed with respect. Jake wrote something down on a small notebook. Next came the Mantari. General Clixt stood on his 4 legs and spread his arms wide. His compound eyes glittered as new images appeared above the table. These showed tiny creatures that looked like metal bugs. "Our bioweapons are superior," General Clixt clicked rapidly. "These nanoorganisms can consume any organic matter at the molecular level. They eat through flesh, wood, plants, anything alive. We can program them to target specific DNA patterns. They once cleared an entire planet of invasive species in just 2 weeks." More sounds of approval came from around the table. Amy shifted in her seat and glanced at Jake, who still looked completely calm. The Aquarians were next. Their delegate, Flowing Current of Deep Waters, did not stand since they had no legs. Instead, they raised several tentacles and spoke in a voice like ocean waves. "Our sonic weapons create sound waves that can travel through space," Flowing Current explained. "They can liquefy internal organs from orbit. We can target individual beings on a planet's surface from our ships in space. The sound waves pass through armor and shields like they are not there. Very clean, very efficient. One by one, each alien race described weapons that could destroy cities, planets, or entire star systems. Some used energy beams that could cut through anything. Others had bombs that could make stars explode. A few had weapons that could bend space and time itself. Jake listened to each presentation with interest, taking notes and asking simple questions. Amy recorded everything on her tablet. The weapons were incredible, far beyond anything humans had ever built or even imagined. Finally, it was humanity's turn. Admiral Vextar looked at Jake with all four eyes. There was a smile on his lizard bird face, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile adults give to children when they ask them to explain something complicated. Human Peterson, Admiral Vextar said slowly, "Your species has only been traveling between stars for 5 years. Your technology is very primitive compared to ours. Most of us have been exploring space for thousands or millions of years. Surely your weapons are quite simple compared to what we have shared today." Several aliens made sounds that Jake's translator told him were laughter. General Throck, the massive Gorlakian, spoke in a voice like an earthquake. "Come now, human. We have seen your kinetic weapons and chemical explosives. Crude but effective for such a young species, certainly, but hardly worth mentioning compared to matter disintegrators or dimensional fracture bombs." Jake stood up slowly. He was not tall compared to most of the aliens in the room, but he stood straight and confident. Amy pressed a button on her tablet, and a simple image appeared above the table. It showed a human head with the brain highlighted in bright yellow. The aliens fell silent. This was not what they had expected to see. "Our deadliest weapon," Jake said in a clear, steady voice, "is not a bomb or a gun or a biological agent. It is this." He pointed to the brain in the image. "Human imagination combined with our absolute refusal to accept that something cannot be done." The silence in the room was complete. Even the background humming of the space station's engines seemed to stop. Several aliens looked at each other with confusion. Others stared at the simple image of a human brain, trying to understand what Jake meant. Counselor Zillith, the ethereal representative, spoke in her voice like wind chimes. "Commander Peterson, surely you are joking. A brain is not a weapon. All thinking species have brains." Jake smiled, but it was not a joking smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret that others did not. "Is it not a weapon?" he asked. "Let me tell you about a human named Paul Martinez." The room remained silent, waiting. Jake had their complete attention now, even though they did not understand why. Amy prepared the next set of images on her tablet, knowing that everything was about to change. Outside the meeting room, space stretched endlessly in all directions, filled with stars and planets and countless forms of life. But inside that room, something important was happening. The galaxy was about to learn something new about humans, something that would change how they saw Earth's people forever. Jake took a deep breath and began to tell them a story that would make them understand why humans were different from every other species they had ever met. The alien representatives shifted in their seats like they were watching a comedy show. Some of them made clicking sounds with their mouths, which Jake had learned meant they were laughing at him. The massive Gorlakian delegate, General Throck, made a sound like rocks falling down a mountain. His translator turned this into words that rumbled through the entire room. "Come now, human. We have seen your simple weapons. You shoot metal bullets from tubes. You make explosions with chemical powders. These things work fine for a species that just learned to fly between planets, but they are like toys compared to our weapons." General Throck waved one of his huge rocky arms toward the images still floating above the table. "We have matter disintegrators that can make anything disappear completely. We have dimensional fracture bombs that can break holes in space itself. Your human weapons are interesting, but not dangerous to us." Other aliens nodded their heads or made agreeing sounds. The Zephyrian representative resonance of the third harmony chimed like musical bells. "The human is trying to be clever, but we are not fooled. Brains are for thinking, not for fighting wars." Jake remained standing calmly in front of the huge, circular table. Amy pressed another button on her tablet and the image above the table changed. Now it showed a simple picture of a human head from the side, with the brain glowing bright yellow inside the skull. Our deadliest weapon, Jake said again, speaking slowly so the translators could keep up, is not made of metal or energy or chemicals. It is not something you can hold in your hands or fire from a ship. It is this. He pointed again to the brain in the image. Human imagination combined with our complete refusal to believe that something is impossible. The room became very quiet. Several delegates looked at each other with expressions that showed they were confused and maybe a little worried. They had expected to hear about nuclear weapons or laser cannons, not about human thinking. The ethereal representative, counselor, Zilith floated a little higher above her seat. Her misty silver form shimmered as she spoke in her wind chime voice. Commander Peterson, I do not understand. All intelligent species have imagination. All thinking beings can solve problems. What makes human brains different from ours? Jake walked closer to the center of the room. The aliens watched him carefully, some leaning forward to hear better. The difference is not in how we think. The difference is in what we refuse to accept. When other species see an impossible situation, they find a different path or they give up. When humans see an impossible situation, we decide that impossible is just another problem to solve. Amy brought up a new series of images on the holographic display. The aliens saw what looked like a very ordinary human male sitting at a primitive computer. He had brown hair, wore simple clothes, and looked like he could be anyone you might meet on the street. Let me tell you about Paul Martinez, Jake continued. Paul was a software engineer from our planet Earth. Nothing special about him at all. He was average height, average weight with no military training. He fixed computer problems for a living. Most people would walk past him on the street and never notice him. The image showed Paul working late at night in what looked like a small office. Coffee cups and food containers were scattered around his desk. His eyes were tired, but his hands kept moving across the keyboard. During our third global conflict, enemy forces captured Paul's hometown, Jake explained. They surrounded the entire city with tanks and soldiers. They controlled all the roads leading in and out. They watched the skies with radar and missiles. They cut off all telephone and internet connections. The enemy had better weapons, better armor, and better technology than the people trapped inside the city. The aliens listened more carefully now. War stories were something they could understand, even if they did not understand the point Jake was trying to make. The enemy held Paul's city under siege for 8 months, Jake continued. No food could come in. No weapons could be delivered to help the people inside. No outside army could break through the enemy lines. By every military rule that exists, the people in that city should have given up. Any reasonable person would have surrendered. General Throck made a rumbling sound. Yes, human. When facing superior forces, surrender is the logical choice. What does this story have to do with weapons? Jake smiled. But it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something that would surprise everyone in the room. The enemy made one mistake, General Throck. They left Paul Martinez alive. And Paul was not a reasonable person. Amy changed the image again. Now it showed a basement filled with strange devices made from pieces of old electronics, kitchen equipment, and things that looked like they came from a junkyard. Wires ran everywhere, connecting computers to radios to microwave ovens to car batteries. The enemy controlled all the communication networks, so Paul built new ones, Jake said. He took apart old televisions and radios and cell phones. He connected them in ways they were never meant to be connected. He made a communication system that the enemy could not detect or stop. The image showed more details of Paul's basement workshop. There were chemicals in glass bottles, electronic circuits spread across tables, and notebooks filled with drawings and calculations. The enemy had better weapons, so Paul made different weapons. He used household cleaning chemicals to make explosives. He turned children's remote control toys into bombs that could be guided from far away. He built radio jammers from microwave ovens that could stop enemy communications. Counselor Zelith's misty form flickered with what Jake had learned meant. She was becoming upset. One person cannot build military equipment in a basement. This is not possible. That is exactly what the enemy forces thought, Jake replied. They knew it was impossible for one untrained civilian to threaten professional soldiers with advanced equipment. So they ignored the weird signals their equipment started picking up. They did not worry about the small explosions that began happening around their camps. They thought these things were just accidents or equipment failures. Amy showed new images of Paul working with other people. Men and women of all ages were gathered around tables, learning to build the same kinds of devices Paul had invented. Within 6 weeks, Paul had taught 50 people how to make his improvised weapons and communication devices. Within 2 months, he had trained 300 people. By the 4th month, every person in the city knew how to build at least one type of weapon or communication tool. General Throck leaned forward, his massive rocky body creaking like a landslide. You expect us to believe that untrained civilians defeated professional military forces? I expect you to believe what actually happened, Jake answered. Within 6 months, Paul's network of ordinary people had destroyed most of the enemy's equipment. They used homemade explosives to blow up tanks. They used improvised radio jammers to blind enemy radar. They used chemical weapons made in kitchen pots to force enemy soldiers out of their positions. The room was completely silent now. Even the background noise of the space station seemed to have stopped. The aliens stared at the images of ordinary humans building weapons from garbage and household items. By the end of the 8th month, the enemy forces gave up and left the city, Jake concluded. They had been defeated by a software engineer and a few hundred civilians using weapons built from spare parts. Professional soldiers with advanced military technology had been beaten by people who learned everything they knew from internet tutorials and chemistry textbooks. Admiral Vextar's 4 eyes were all focused on Jake. His voice came through the translator very quietly. This Paul Martinez must have been some kind of military genius. Jake shook his head. No, Admiral. Paul Martinez was just a human who refused to accept that his situation was hopeless. And that is why our brains are the most dangerous weapons in the galaxy. Amy pressed more buttons on her tablet, and the images above the table changed again. Now the aliens could see Paul Martinez more clearly. He looked tired and thin, with dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were dirty and had holes in them. His hands were covered with small cuts and burns from working with dangerous chemicals and sharp metal pieces. Let me show you exactly what Paul did during those 8 months, Jake said, walking slowly around the table so he could look at each alien delegate. The enemy forces thought they had everything under control. They had tanks, helicopters, and soldiers with the best weapons money could buy. They had satellites watching from space and drones flying over the city every day. The image changed to show the city from above. It was surrounded by enemy camps with roads blocked by concrete barriers and metal fences. Guard towers stood at every corner, and searchlights swept back and forth during the night. The enemy commander was General Harrison Webb, a man with 30 years of military experience. He had fought in 12 different wars and had never lost a battle. He looked at this city and saw exactly what any smart military officer would see. A few thousand civilians with no weapons, no training, and no way to get help from outside. Jake stopped walking and pointed to the image. General Webb made all the right tactical decisions. He cut off power to the city, so people could not use electric lights or communication devices. He poisoned the water supply, forcing people to drink from rain puddles and old wells. He shot at anyone who tried to leave, making it clear that surrender was the only option. The aliens watched as the images showed the terrible conditions inside the city. People were hungry, scared, and desperate. Children cried in their parents' arms. Old people sat in dark rooms with no heat or electricity. It looked like a place where hope had died. For the first month, everything went exactly as General Webb expected, Jake continued. People were too scared to fight back. They stayed inside their houses and waited for someone to save them. The general was confident that the city would surrender within 2 months, maybe 3 at most. Amy changed the image to show Paul Martinez in his basement again, but now the view was wider. The aliens could see that he was not alone. A woman, with gray hair, sat at one table, carefully mixing chemicals in glass containers. A teenage boy worked at another table, taking apart old radio equipment with tiny screwdrivers. But Paul did not wait for someone to save him. He started with the simplest problem first. The enemy was jamming all radio signals so people inside the city could not talk to each other. Paul knew that communication was the most important thing in any war. The image showed Paul's hands as he worked. He took pieces from broken televisions, old car radios, and even children's walkie-talkies. He connected them with wires and patterns that looked like spiderwebs. Nothing he built looked like real military equipment, but somehow it all worked together. Paul figured out that the enemy's jamming equipment only blocked normal radio frequencies, so he built transmitters that used frequencies nobody normally uses. He hid them inside fake rocks and old trash cans around the city. Within 2 weeks, people could send messages to each other again. General Throck made a sound like grinding stone. Impossible. Military jamming equipment blocks all frequencies. One civilian cannot outsmart professional signal intelligence officers. That is what General Webb thought too, Jake replied. His experts told him that the strange signals they were detecting must be equipment malfunctions or interference from solar radiation. They never considered that someone might build communication devices from kitchen appliances and television parts. The image changed to show Paul teaching other people. A man who looked like a school teacher was learning to build small explosive devices. A woman who might have been a nurse was studying charts that showed how to make chemical weapons, from cleaning supplies and fertilizer. Paul shared everything he learned. He did not keep his inventions secret. He taught anyone who wanted to learn. The gray-haired woman was Linda Hayes, a retired chemistry teacher. The teenage boy was Tony Kim, who had been studying electronics in high school before the war started. Amy brought up new images showing the results of Paul's teaching. People were building strange devices in basements, garages, and even in sewers. Some made weapons that could be hidden inside everyday objects. Others created communication equipment that looked like broken toys or garbage. Linda Hayes figured out how to make explosive gel from household chemicals. It was 10 times more powerful than normal explosives, and it could be shaped like clay or putty. Tony Kim learned how to turn remote control car parts into guidance systems for homemade missiles. The aliens were becoming more uncomfortable as they watched. These were not professional soldiers or weapons experts. These were ordinary people doing things that should have been impossible with the materials they had available. By the 3rd month, Paul's network had grown to include almost everyone in the city. Jake continued. Doctors were making poison, gas from medical supplies. Construction workers were building armored vehicles from concrete and steel plates. Even children were helping by carrying messages and small devices through spaces too narrow for adults. Counselor Zelith's misty form was flickering rapidly now, which Jake knew meant she was very worried. Commander Peterson, you describe chaos, not military strategy. Untrained civilians cannot coordinate complex military operations. Can they not? Jake asked. Let me show you what happened during the Battle of Morrison Street. Amy changed the display to show a street map. Red dots marked enemy positions while blue dots showed where Paul's people were hidden. The enemy had tanks and armored vehicles positioned to control the main road through the city. General Webb decided to make an example. He sent 2 companies of soldiers with heavy weapons to destroy one neighborhood completely. He wanted to show everyone what would happen if they continued to resist. The map showed enemy forces moving down the street in perfect military formation. Tanks led the way, followed by armored trucks full of soldiers. Everything looked professional and unstoppable. But Paul's people had been watching and planning for weeks. They knew exactly when and where the attack would come. Linda Hayes had placed her explosive gel in the storm sewers under the street. Tony Kim had hidden guided missiles in fake garbage piles. Other people had set up chemical weapons in abandoned buildings. The tactical display showed what happened next. As the enemy forces moved down the street, explosions began happening all around them. The explosions came from underground, from rooftops, and from directions the soldiers had never expected. The attack lasted exactly 17 minutes. Jake said quietly. When it was over, General Webb had lost 60 soldiers, 4 tanks, and 3 armored vehicles. Paul's people had used weapons that cost less than $1,000 total to destroy equipment worth millions. The room was completely silent. The alien stared at the tactical display, trying to understand how such a thing could be possible. The most important part, Jake continued, was that nobody in Paul's network had ever been in the military before that day. They learned everything they needed to know by watching internet videos, reading library books, and experimenting with materials they found in their own homes. Admiral Vextar spoke in a voice so quiet that his translator could barely pick it up. How many casualties did the civilians suffer? Jake smiled grimly. 0. Paul had planned escape routes through the sewer system. Every person who participated in the attack was back in their basement workshop within an hour, building weapons for the next battle. The implications of what Jake was describing began to sink in around the room. These were not soldiers defeating other soldiers in fair combat. This was something much more dangerous and unpredictable. Amy pressed several buttons on her tablet at once, and the holographic display changed completely. Instead of showing just Paul Martinez and his city, now it showed a timeline that stretched across the entire space above the table. Dozens of different images appeared, each one showing different humans in different places and times. You see, Paul Martinez was not special, Jake said as he walked around the table again. This is how humans fight all wars. We do not just use the weapons we already have. We invent completely new ones while the fighting is still happening, often using materials that our enemies think are harmless. The timeline showed images from many different human conflicts. Each picture had a date and a name underneath it. The aliens could see that these events had happened all across human history, on different continents and in different centuries. Here's Bill Thompson, a corn farmer from the American Midwest, Jake said, pointing to an image of a man standing next to what looked like a metal fortress on wheels. During our Second World War, enemy forces invaded his country. They had tanks and machine guns. Bill had farming equipment and sheets of metal from old barns. The image showed Bill working in a field with several other men. They were welding metal plates onto the sides of a large tractor. The finished vehicle looked nothing like a real military tank, but it was covered in thick armor and had weapons sticking out of slots in the metal. Bill built 12 armored vehicles from farm tractors and construction equipment. He used them to defend his town against professional soldiers. His homemade tanks were slower than real tanks, but they were much harder to destroy. He won every battle he fought. Amy moved to the next image on the timeline. This one showed a young woman with long black hair working at a laboratory table, covered with glass bottles and chemical equipment. This is Lisa Chang, a chemistry student at Beijing University. When enemy forces surrounded her city, she was in her second year of studying chemical engineering. She had never built a weapon in her life, but she had access to a university chemistry lab. The image changed to show Lisa teaching a group of other students. They were all wearing safety glasses and rubber gloves, carefully mixing different chemicals in small containers. Lisa developed 17 new types of explosive compounds, using only materials she could buy at hardware stores and pharmacies. Her explosives were more powerful than military-grade bombs, but they could be made by anyone with basic chemistry knowledge. She taught hundreds of students how to make them. General Throck made a sound like an avalanche starting. His massive, rocky form leaned forward until he was looming over the human table. You cannot be serious, human. University students cannot create military explosives. This requires years of specialized training and expensive equipment. Does it? Jake asked calmly. Lisa's chemistry professor said the same thing, right up until her students used homemade explosives to destroy an entire enemy tank division. The enemy commander could not understand how his armored vehicles were being destroyed by bombs that did not appear on any of his sensors. Amy moved the timeline forward again. Now the image showed a man covered in grease and oil, working underneath what looked like a normal passenger car. But the car had been changed in many ways. Extra armor plated covered the sides, and strange devices were attached to the roof and trunk. Danny Walsh was an auto mechanic in Detroit. When the war came to his city, he took every abandoned car he could find and turned them into fighting vehicles. He built an entire fleet of combat cars from vehicles that people had left behind when they fled the fighting. The display showed dozens of modified cars driving through city streets. Some had weapons mounted on their roofs. Others were covered in thick metal plates. A few had been changed so much that they barely looked like cars anymore. Danny's car army defeated 3 separate enemy attacks on his neighborhood. The enemy had real military vehicles, but they could not keep up with cars that could drive through buildings, hide in parking garages, and disappear into traffic tunnels. Counselor Zelith's ethereal form was shimmering with agitation. Her wind chime voice sounded strained when she spoke. Commander Peterson, you describe individuals acting without coordination. Surely your military commanders organize these innovations and improvements. Jake stopped walking and looked directly at her glowing form. That is the most important part, Counselor Zelith. They do not. Human military doctrine includes something we call individual initiative. We actually train our soldiers to ignore orders if they can think of something better to do. The timeline display changed to show military training exercises. Human soldiers were practicing with standard weapons. But then the scene shifted to show the same soldiers modifying their equipment in dozens of different ways. We encourage our people to change their weapons, develop new tactics, and create new solutions while battles are happening. Every human soldier is expected to be an inventor, an engineer, and a tactical genius all at the same time. The alien delegates began talking among themselves in rapid, worried tones that their translators could barely keep up with. Admiral Vextar raised one clawed hand to call for quiet, but his voice sounded shaky when he spoke. Commander Peterson, you describe military chaos, not proper command structure. How can any army function when individual soldiers make their own decisions about weapons and tactics? Very effectively, apparently, Jake replied. Amy, show them the Battle of New Geneva. The holographic display shifted to show a space battle. The aliens recognized the tactical symbols immediately. This was from humanity's first major engagement after they had achieved interstellar travel. The human fleet was vastly outnumbered by ships belonging to an aggressive species called the Ravagers. The Ravagers had been conquering star systems for over 2,000 years, Jake explained as the tactical display showed the overwhelming enemy advantage. They had better ships, better weapons, better shields, and better everything else. Their plasma cannons could cut through our hulls like paper. Their energy shields could deflect our best missiles. By every military calculation that exists, we should have been completely destroyed in the first 10 minutes. The battle footage showed human ships taking terrible damage. Many vessels were venting atmosphere and debris into space. Some ships were breaking apart completely, leaving only scattered wreckage behind. But then something happened that the Ravagers did not expect, Jake continued. Our ships began to adapt and change their tactics in real time, not because Fleet Command ordered them to, but because individual crew members started thinking creatively. The display showed human ships beginning to move in strange patterns. Instead of fighting like a traditional space fleet, they started behaving more like a swarm of angry insects. Captain Rick Hansen of the destroyer Phoenix noticed that Ravager shields operated on a specific energy frequency, so he modified his communication array to broadcast interference on that same frequency. It took him 20 minutes to figure out how to disrupt their defenses. Amy highlighted one human ship on the display. The aliens could see it broadcasting some kind of signal that was making nearby enemy ships vulnerable to weapons fire. Lieutenant Kate Foster on the cruiser Liberty realized that Ravager plasma weapons left brief ionization trails in space. She reprogrammed her sensor equipment to track backwards along these trails to find the exact location of enemy weapon systems. Another human ship began targeting enemy weapons with impossible accuracy, hitting weak points that should have been impossible to detect from such distances. Within 40 minutes of first contact, our fleet had developed 12 new tactical innovations, 7 equipment modifications, and 3 completely new weapon configurations. All of this came from individual crew members thinking of new solutions under extreme pressure. The tactical display showed the tide of battle turning completely. The superior Ravager fleet found themselves being outmaneuvered, outthought, and ultimately defeated by what should have been easy prey. The Ravager commander sent a message to our fleet asking how we had developed such advanced tactics so quickly, Jake said. He wanted to know which military academy had trained our officers, and how long we had been planning this battle strategy. Jake walked back toward his seat but remained standing. Our fleet commander told him the truth. Nobody had planned any of it. Everything the Ravagers had seen was invented by individual humans during the battle itself. People who had never fought in space before were creating new ways to fight as the battle happened. The alien delegates sat in stunned silence, staring at the battle display. Admiral Vextar spoke in a whisper that his translator could barely detect. Are you telling us that your greatest military strength is that your people never follow orders? Jake smiled grimly. Admiral, we follow orders when orders make sense, but when the situation changes, we expect every human to become a weapons designer, a tactical genius, and a strategic revolutionary all at the same time. And the more impossible you make our situation, the more creative we become. Jake walked back to his seat and sat down slowly. Amy closed her tablet and placed it on the table in front of her. The holographic display still showed the aftermath of the battle with the Ravagers, with human ships regrouping around the wreckage of what had once been a superior enemy fleet. The silence in the Galactic Council chamber was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. 12 different alien species sat frozen in their seats, staring at the battle display with expressions of shock, fear, and disbelief. Even the background humming of the space station's engines seemed to have stopped. Admiral Vextar was the first to speak. His 4 eyes were all focused on Jake, and his scaled hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his claws were scratching marks in the metal surface. "Commander Peterson," the Admiral said in a voice barely above, a whisper, "are you telling us that humanity's greatest strength is that your people never know when they are supposed to lose?" Jake nodded slowly. He looked around the table at each alien delegate, meeting their eyes or sensors or whatever they used to see. "Admiral, in our language, we have a phrase that explains how humans think. We say, 'Hold my beer and watch this.' It is usually said right before a human does something that should be completely impossible." General Throck's massive rocky form shifted in his seat, making sounds like a small earthquake. "What does this phrase about beer mean, human?" "It means that when a human sees something that everyone says cannot be done, we hand our drink to a friend and then we try to do it anyway," Jake explained. "We have an entire culture built around proving that impossible things are just problems that nobody has solved yet." Amy reactivated her tablet and brought up a new image. This one showed a simple mathematical equation floating above the table. Human creativity plus desperate circumstances exponentially escalating innovation. "This is the formula that describes how humans fight," Jake continued. "The more hopeless our situation becomes, the more creative we get. The more you try to limit our options, the more new options we invent. Every time someone tells us something is impossible, we take it as a personal challenge." Counselor Zillith's ethereal form was flickering so rapidly that she looked like a broken hologram. Her wind chime voice was shaking when she spoke. "But, Commander Peterson, this means that humans become more dangerous as they become more desperate. Most species become less effective when they are pushed to their limits." "Exactly," Jake replied. "That is what makes us different. Other species fight with the weapons they have. Humans fight with the weapons they can imagine, and human imagination has no limits." The Zephyrian representative, resonance of the third harmony, chimed like cracked bells. "You speak of imagination as if it were a military resource. But imagination is just thinking about things that do not exist." Jake smiled, but it was not a comforting smile. "Is it? Let me ask you something, Resonance. Before today, did you think it was possible for untrained civilians to defeat professional military forces using weapons built from household items?" The crystal being's form dimmed noticeably. "No, I did not think such a thing was possible. But now you know it is possible because I showed you proof that it happened," Jake continued. "Paul Martinez imagined it was possible before anyone else did. That imagination became reality, which then became a military victory. Human imagination turns impossible ideas into actual weapons." Amy brought up a final image on the holographic display. It showed thousands of human faces, men, women, young and old, from every part of Earth. They were all ordinary-looking people, the kind you might see walking down any street or working at any job. "Every single person in this image," Jake said, "is potentially a weapons designer, a tactical genius, or a strategic revolutionary. They do not need special training or expensive equipment. They just need a problem that everyone else thinks is impossible to solve." The alien delegates stared at the sea of human faces with growing horror. These were not soldiers or scientists or engineers. These were farmers, teachers, shop clerks, students, and retirees. They looked completely harmless. The most terrifying part, Jake continued, is that we do not even realize we are doing anything special. To us, this is just normal human behavior. When we face a problem, we solve it. When someone tells us something cannot be done, we figure out how to do it anyway. We think every intelligent species works this way. General Throck made a sound like grinding stone. But surely human creativity has limits. There must be some problems that even humans cannot solve. Jake looked thoughtful for a moment. You know, General, that is a very interesting question. In our entire history, we have never found a problem that absolutely could not be solved by at least one human somewhere. We have found problems that took us a long time to solve, and problems that required many humans working together. But we have never found a problem that stopped us permanently. The implications of Jake's words hung in the air like a dangerous storm cloud. The alien delegates began to understand that they were not just talking about military tactics or weapons technology. They were talking about a fundamental difference in how humans approached any kind of challenge. What you are describing, Admiral Vextar said slowly, is a species that treats the impossible as merely inconvenient. That is probably the most accurate description of humanity I have ever heard, Jake replied. We have a saying, difficult things we do immediately, impossible things take a little longer. Most humans think this is a joke, but it is actually a pretty good summary of how we approach problems. Counselor Zillith's form had stopped flickering, but now she was glowing much brighter than before, which Jake knew meant she was experiencing extreme stress. Commander Peterson, this conversation has been very educational, but I must ask you a direct question. Should the other species in this galaxy be afraid of humanity? Jake considered the question carefully before answering. Counselor, I think that depends entirely on whether you plan to be our friends or our enemies. Humans are the most loyal allies you could ever have. We will share our technology, our resources, and our knowledge freely with anyone who treats us with respect and friendship. He paused and looked around the table again. But if you try to conquer us or enslave us or destroy us, then yes, you should probably be very afraid, because humans have a long history of doing impossible things to people who threaten us or our friends. The chamber fell silent again as the alien delegates absorbed this information. Finally, Admiral Vextar spoke in a voice that carried a mixture of respect and fear. Commander Peterson, I believe I speak for all the species represented here when I say that we would very much like to be humanity's friends. Jake smiled, and this time it was a genuinely warm and friendly smile. Admiral, that is exactly what we were hoping to hear, because the galaxy is a big place, full of challenges that might require impossible solutions. And as I mentioned, humans specialize in making the impossible merely difficult. The vote to grant humanity full membership in the Galactic Defense Alliance was unanimous. Several species quietly began updating their diplomatic protocols to ensure that they never accidentally made enemies of Earth's people. After all, the universe was full of threats and mysteries that had puzzled civilizations for millions of years. Having a species of problem solvers who refused to accept that anything was truly impossible seemed like a very good thing to have on their side. And if any hostile force ever threatened the peace of the galaxy, they would discover what every human enemy throughout history had eventually learned, that making humans desperate was the same as making them infinitely creative. That was a lesson that very few aggressors survived long enough to share with others.